offshore tax shelters revealed in the Panama Papers, bribes buying compliance from officials in far-off lands, impeachment proceedings in Brazil. Foreign or domestic, to read the headlines lately, one might conclude everyone these days is on the take. Is the world mired in a culture of corruption? Let's ask. Anita Anand, she is the J.R. Kimber Chair in Investor Protection and Corporate Governance and Professor of Law at the University of Toronto. Alicia Nahirni, Executive Director of Transparency International Canada. Akash Maharaj, Chief Executive Officer at GOPAC, the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption. And Martin Reg-Khan, political columnist for the Toronto Star. And it's great to have everybody around our set today for a conversation about how rampant the problem of corruption is worldwide. Do you want to start us off on that? What do you think?
Corruption is now undoubtedly the single greatest threat to the viability of democracies, to national security, and to the rights of all mankind.
Not terrorism.
Not terrorism. But indeed, terrorism, international terrorism would be impossible without the corruption which provides the financial backbone to finance terrorist organizations. Until 2010, the BBC conducted a worldwide survey of citizens across the globe to find out what are the citizens of the world talking about. The single most discussed subject on the planet, more than religion, more than politics, more than war and peace, more than jobs and the economy, was corruption. Corruption is now the main driver of terrorism, the main driver of war and famine. It is the source of most of the miseries that beset the human race.
Let's continue around our table here. Anita, what's your view on that?
I think in this respect, you need to look at which jurisdiction we're talking about. Mm-hmm. Canada and the United States, although there are corrupt companies, without question, have a very strong securities and corporate law regime. Enforcement of the laws on the books is always an issue, but in terms of the comprehensiveness of the legal regime, we stand in fairly good stead.
So in your view, not everybody is on the take.
I think we need to be specific about what we're talking about when we use the word corruption and when we use the words enforcement, and which country in particular we're talking about is very important.
Well, as a matter of fact, we do happen to have a little list here. Sheldon, can we do this now? Let's go. Here's a list. This is, Alicia, your organization that puts this out. Mm-hmm. The Transparency International organization puts a list out of the least corrupt countries. We should all move to Denmark. They're just wonderful there. Denmark, number 1, Finland, Sweden, New Zealand, Netherlands, Norway, Switzerland, Singapore. There we are at number 9, which is not bad if you consider maybe 200 plus countries in the world. We're number 9. Germany, Luxembourg, the UK, the US, incidentally, at number 16. Okay, so you guys study this. How corrupt is the world based on your latest findings?
Well, Transparency International has been around for over 20 years. The Canadian chapter has been around for almost 20 years. The fight against corruption continues, and it's not getting any easier. And those findings show only part of the story. The fact that we are 9th least corrupt country in the world does not mean that we do not have corruption problems. We also have an index called Global Corruption Barometer, which looks at public perceptions of corruptions. And for instance, 62% of Canadians in our 2013 study thought that political parties were corrupt in Canada.
Corrupt, meaning what?
Corruption, as defined by Transparency International, is the abuse of publicly entrusted power for private gain.
Okay, Martin, you've done a little reporting on this. Would you like to equate what's been going on related to political fundraising at Queen's Park with corruption?
Sure. I think.
Yes, that's a yes.
Sure. I'd like to talk about it. I wouldn't say they're equivalent. I think so much of corruption is perception. That's not to say that there's not a tremendous amount of reality that behind it, but it's all relative and it's all geographical. So around the world, we've heard about the kinds of corruption that takes place. I've seen it in my own reporting overseas when I was abroad for the Toronto Star. But it's relative, and when we talk about what's happening in Canada, I think there's kind of a Canadian corruption paradox. People here really believe there is a tremendous amount of corruption in Canada, in Ontario. Mm-hmm. And I think that to go from that perception of corruption to criminality is a huge leap. we had the Charbonneau Commission in Quebec, which looked at corruption in Quebec. And it found a lot of leads and a lot of interesting material. But the amount of actual corruption in Quebec was relatively slim, at least in terms of what we've found. In Ontario, there hasn't really been any smoking gun. That's not to say that there isn't the potential for corruption. And I think, to go back to your question about fundraising, I think that's what people are afraid of, is that corruption can be human nature, and temptation is a very powerful force. And if we do have fundraising laws that are lax and that allow companies and unions and other entities, or even large donors, to contribute a large amount of money, there is obviously a temptation, there is a perception, and there is a risk. And just briefly, before I forget this, in the last Progressive Conservative leadership race a year or so ago, one donor gave $100,000 to one of the candidates, not to Patrick Brown, the current PC leader. He's asked me to keep reminding people that he was not the recipient of that, but to Christine Elliott, $100,000, and that was legal.
Do we know who it was?
It's the heir, the son of a forestry baron, if I can use that outmoded word, in Northern Ontario. I forget his name. He had been an intern at Queen's Park, much like your interns here at TVO, and had thought well of Kristen Elliott. But $100,000, my goodness, how could that possibly happen and not have implications for perceptions of corruption?
Can you, Akash, speak to this very interesting juxtaposition where polls seem to indicate that people in Canada think that things are rotten to the core, but they actually aren't?
That's an interesting point. TI does put out these two reports, one that says that Canada is the 9th least corrupt country in the world, another that says that 3/4 of Canadians feel that their government is ineffective in fighting corruption. And by that metric, that means Canadians have less confidence in our own government's public probity than do the citizens of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Nigeria.
How does that make any sense at all?
In some ways, it speaks to I think the general skepticism Canadians have about the political class, full stop. But I think they're not totally unrelated. That is to say, there is a very low tolerance for domestic corruption in Canada, and that in part drives an economy and a system that is less corrupt than elsewhere. But I think that there is a major fly in the ointment. We shouldn't pat ourselves on the back too much in Canada, in that an additional paradox for Canada is that although we have relatively low corruption domestically, many Canadian companies, when they are actors on the international stage, seem to forget all of the restraints that are imposed upon them here.
Okay, hold off on that. We're going to get to that in a little bit. But I do want to follow up on this angle here that I mean, we have many institutions in place in this country, laws, regulations, ombuds people, whatever the expression
Integrity
is.
commissioners.
Integrity commissioners, right. All of these people who are invited, both federally and provincially and municipally now, to make sure that everything is on the up and up. And yet there is this persistent view among the public that we're just rife with corruption everywhere.
Well, this is why I think it's very important for us to specify what we mean when we use the term corruption. There are, you're right, many statutes. There's the Criminal Code of Canada, there's the Foreign Corrupt Purposes Act, there's the Accountability Act. There are a lot of statutes on the books that address quote-unquote corruption in our society, in our Canadian society. But I would like us as a society and a panel to be specific about what we're discussing when we use the term corruption. I think it's important. It allows for context and it allows us to have a more meaningful discussion.
Amen. To that end, Martin, there has been great, I'll use an expression that you like because you used to report from here, Sturm und Drang over the years about whether the gas plant scandal in Ontario is incompetence or corruption. Which is it?
And my favorite word for that is when people say it's a scandal, I call it a boondoggle. And I think there's a difference. Boondoggle does not necessarily imply criminality. Scandal often suggests criminality, although it doesn't necessarily specify that. And when we look at the gas plant scandal / boondoggle here, there's never been any suggestion that anybody lined their pockets, got caught with their hand in the cookie jar. Incompetence, blind loyalty, not really putting the public interest at the top and instead thinking about partisan advantage, yes. For example, canceling the Mississauga gas plants, I think about 8 days before Election Day in order to reassure themselves that they would win the most seats in that area. So that's a distinction that has to be drawn. But I want to just pick up on that earlier point about perceptions. Yes, Canada is number 9. We're also number 1 in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas. That's how good we are. So why do we believe there is so much corruption? Maybe it's in the Canadian nature, our persnickety nature, and maybe that's a good thing, as you're suggesting. Maybe it is that hypervigilance. I would call it even paranoia.
Can I offer another alternative?
Yes.
Maybe it's the Toronto Star screaming in 60-point type headlines every single day about how the sky is falling in when it isn't. Is that possible?
And maybe that's what's saving us from corruption. How's that? But I do think the media generally, and the Star is part of it, leads the way in a lot of investigations. For example, on the Orange helicopter scandal, that was a scandal. There's an OPP investigation. The Star brought that forward, and I think it is that kind of hypervigilance that perhaps keeps corruption at bay in Canada.
What do you think explains, Alicia, this conundrum between how things really are and what the public thinks things really are?
Corruption is a very complex phenomenon, and as you can imagine, operating an anti-corruption organization in Canada is quite challenging. But for us, the issues are much broader. We're looking at anti-money laundering. We're looking at something called beneficial ownership, which ties into the real estate market in Toronto and Vancouver. We're looking at how Canada, for instance, can be used as a haven for corrupt money to flow in. We're looking how we can be exporters of corruption, how our companies operate abroad. We're also looking at whistleblower protection. And it's all good and well to have institutions and laws in place, but what you also need to have is enforcement. And Transparency International does something called National Integrity System Studies. And what that study looks at is how effective are those institutions and those laws. The fact that they're in place is good, but it's not enough.
Do you think that Martin's glasses are a little too rose-colored at the moment?
I think that Canada is not without its problems. We have our own corruption issues. I think that the media and investigative journalists do a very good job of bringing those issues to light, sometimes better than resource-stricken NGOs. And I think those issues need to be dealt with. And I don't think the Canadian public is wrong sometimes in its perception.
MRC?
Your question just made me think of a new way of looking at corruption. I think we need to think in terms of politicians, at least, in terms of distortions, distorted decision-making. That's one of the problems that had me concerned about fundraising when I was looking at the enormous loopholes and the way in which fundraisers and donors can distort the system, but distort decision-making and, of course, distort access. But that's still a far cry from criminality, and I do sometimes worry that we try too hard to criminalize political behavior that is part of the rough and tumble of politics. I think we need to keep some perspective here.
Well, to that end, you used to be, what were you, National Policy Chair or something like that for the Federal Liberal Party?
I was, for my sins.
Back in the day? Okay, well, you know that there's been a fundraising, I'm not going to call it a scandal, let's call it an issue. There's been a debate about how rough and tumble fundraising is in the province of Ontario. Kudos where it's due, mostly led by this guy's work. Let me read this to you and I'll get your view on this. In former Liberal Cabinet Minister Greg Sorbera's day, the tables at events like the Heritage Dinner, which is an annual Liberal fundraiser, cost closer to $5,000. But the effect was the same. People would ask him what they would get in return for paying large amounts of money to the governing party. My answer was always the same. What you get is the satisfaction of supporting the democratic process in Ontario, the former finance minister said. How do you think that explanation plays across the broad swath of Ontario?
Very poorly. I think that most Ontarians, most Canadians feel that if a corporation is making a payment to anything, they're expecting to get a return on investment for their shareholders. And indeed, it is not just the right, it is the responsibility of a CEO making an expenditure to only make that expenditure if he can justify it to his shareholders by saying, there is some material benefit to you for me doing that. And that's why I think it is so important and has been so valuable for the federal government of Canada to ban corporate and union contributions and to cap contributions by individuals. And I'm heartened to see that the government of Ontario is likely to follow suit.
Every government, though, Akash, always says, I defy you to find a smoking gun. I defy you to say that contribution begat that policy change which benefited this company. Fair to say?
It's fair to say that everyone makes that argument. I think it's also fair to say that it is almost impossible in the complex world of public policy development to trace cause and effect, even when it is a virtuous cause and effect. ultimately, there are two questions. First of all, are companies, let's say for the sake of argument, that all political actors are paragons of virtue. Nevertheless, corporations are making those donations in the hopes that they will purchase influence. Otherwise, there is no point to making it. And secondly, even if corporations themselves were also paragons of virtue, it is sapping public confidence in the political system.
How do you know that?
One of the reasons why I think that Canadians feel that Canada does have a corrupt system above and beyond any evidence to the contrary is the fact that there is this constant drip feed of stories in the press about large contributions. And I do think it is fair enough for Canadians to say, what are those people getting in exchange for the money that they're donating? Moreover, the fact that the federal political system has worked extremely well without corporate contributions demonstrates that corporate and large individual contributions are not necessary to maintain our democracy.
Let me do one more question on this. You know the corporate sector.
Yes.
Do you think companies give money with the expectation that there is a quid pro quo attached to it?
Well, I did want to respond to Akash's characterization of the duties of the board in a company.
Okay.
The duties of the board are not actually in law to service the shareholders. The duties of the board, and therefore the direction in which the company will travel as a result of those decisions at the board level, are to act in the best interests of the corporation as a whole. And that is distinct and is in law distinct from a duty owed only to shareholders.
Making as much money as possible, in other
It's a
words.
very, very important distinction going forward when we're thinking about this topic. It is not simply to line the pocketbooks of shareholders. That's one of a number of considerations depending on the corporation at issue.
Okay. Let me, because you talk about lining pockets, we're going to talk about lining pockets here. You ready to go? Sheldon, let's put up this graphic. Around the world, it's estimated $1 trillion is paid in bribes every year. More than 50% of companies in the Middle East and North Africa identify corruption as a major constraint. 27% of companies in sub-Saharan Africa are expected to give, quote unquote, gifts to public officials to, again, quote unquote, get things done. Almost half of firms in South Asia are expected to give gifts to secure a government contract. That published in the Huffington Post, according to the World Bank. Okay, let's get into this. When companies pay bribes, gifts, call them what you want, in order to get things done, is that just simply the price of doing business around the world?
It's funny that you asked that question because in the 1990s, it was very much the price of doing business. It was an expense that could be written off, paying a bribe. No
Is that
longer.
right? You could
Right.
deduct that from your taxable income?
Right.
Paying a bribe?
Yes.
Interesting. Okay.
But that's not the case anymore, and it is definitely not the case for Canadian companies operating abroad, and there are severe consequences now that are in the form of legislation that Canada has. So no, the answer is a simple no. It is not the price of getting business.
If a corporate executive has a choice between, in a tough economy, losing a potential contract and therefore having to lay off 500 people back at the factory, or paying that $25,000 bribe or however much it is in order to help secure that contract and keep all of those people employed, that's a tough call, isn't it?
Well, I look at it a little bit differently. What does the law require me to do as the corporate executive? Am I required to follow the Foreign Corrupt Purposes legislation or not?
I guess you are.
And you are. And
So you don't worry about the 500 people getting laid off because they lose the contract.
I do worry. I would worry if I were a CEO. But by and large, we need to first and foremost know what our legal obligations are and then work within those parameters.
Maybe I'm trying to, it could be I'm trying to find nuance here for argument's sake, but is there, is this more nuanced than you cannot pay bribes under any circumstances ever?
Well, look, my experience overseas is as a journalist comes to mind when you talk about this. I think it's what you can get away with, and so if you can't get away with it, you won't, and you won't declare it as an expense. If you can get away with it, corporate executives make all kinds of trade-offs that may not always seem ethical to us. One of the interesting things about my time, spending time in Indonesia in the late 1980s and early 1990s, was that it was common practice then, if you went to a news conference, perhaps given by a corporate executive or a government official, there would be envelopes for the journalists. Inside those envelopes would be cash, not press releases, Steve, but cash. And so that was considered part of the normal work flow, cash flow, workflow.
Cash for what?
For favorable coverage. You come to the news conference, instead of muffins and coffee, well, there's muffins and coffee as well, and tea. But there's also the cash envelopes that are distributed. They're not on the table, but they're handed discreetly to the journalists.
Did you ever take one?
Well, I was never offered one. Had I been offered, I certainly would have considered it. No, that's a joke.
Can I just say that there seems to be, and there is a gray area in terms of corporate conduct because of the lack of enforceability of some laws. And so until very recently, the Foreign Corrupt Purposes legislation that addresses behavior of corporate executives abroad, for example, in SNC-Lavalin in Libya, that legislation has not always been utilized. And so there is a gray area in which companies perhaps were unsure about the extent to which their overseas conduct would get them into trouble.
I'm not going to operate on the assumption that everybody knows this story. So can you take a minute here and just give us the background of SNC-Lavalin? Because it's probably the most high-profile case of a Canadian company getting embroiled in this kind of a story.
Certainly. It's a Montreal-based company, more than 100 years old, an engineering and procurement firm, one of what the government of Quebec calls national champions for the province of Quebec, and has received significant support from both provincial and federal governments. In the early 2000s, it was rumors began circulating, and rumors turned into a flood, and they were caught in a series of illicit activities. One was providing some $35 million in unexplained payments to Muammar Gaddafi and his family in Libya. Another was providing multi-million-dollar payments to the person who was in charge of tendering for Montreal Hospital. Yet another was a hydroelectric project in India. In all those cases, many millions of dollars had passed from the company to political intermediaries in exchange for business. The CEO of SNC-Lavalin had to resign. He is now being criminally charged, as are other executive members.
Criminally charged by whom?
By the government of Canada. And I think that and to give you a sense of how much of a black eye this one company gave Canada, the World Bank has a list of debarred firms. These are their list of the world's most corrupt firms who are banned from bidding on World Bank projects in any way, shape, or form. In 2013, there were 250 of those companies. 120 of them were Canadian because they were all connected to SNC-Lavalin.
What do you make of that?
It throws up yet another paradox about the way Canada is perceived internationally. Canadians are viewed as being domestically Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts. We are viewed as having high levels of integrity and probity domestically. That is not the perception of the way our companies behave on the international stage. And until laws like the Canadian law against the corruption of foreign public officials came into being, there was a clear sense that Canada's wealth and its ability to afford high standards of living and high standards of domestic property were purchased on the back of illicit activity around the world. And it will be a number of years before we fully recover our reputation on the international stage for the same level of probity, I think, internationally that we have domestically.
Can I just circle back to one thing? I'm sorry, but it ties into what you were just saying about perceptions of our overseas conduct, perceptions of our conduct at home. I don't think we can go on without mentioning that there is a real concrete problem of corruption at the municipal level. It just gets a lot less attention because it's fragmented, because media are now fragmented and smaller in these localities. But we've talked a lot about provincial and federal campaign limits and so on, but at the municipal level, the potential, the temptation, corporate as well, for corruption is immense because of land developers and zoning, and also at the provincial level, the green belt. And so there is no question, if you look at the fundraising patterns in Ontario, municipally, roughly 50% of the corporate donations, as I recall, are from land developers. So it's just a huge temptation that ties into this perception of Canada not having significant problems at the national or even provincial level. And the other aspect of that, I would say, is we just need to pay attention. We need to focus.
Got to be ever vigilant on this, don't you?
Yeah,
and there are very few integrity commissioners municipally around the country.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of shenanigans. And you and I know of some provincial politicians who have been influenced by, or people who have attempted to influence these politicians at the land developer level in terms of contributions and so on.
Can I just say one thing? When Akash was speaking, it appeared as though he was generalizing and referring to companies, Canadian companies as a whole. And I would just like to bring in some evidence from the IMF. The IMF does financial stability review of jurisdictions around the world and consistently has ranked Canada's financial stability as being very strong. And so I think we need to, again, be clear about the fact that we're not talking about all 3,000 companies listed on stock exchanges in Canada. That when we are talking about corruption globally and nationally, that these are certain select companies and not Canadian companies generally.
Let's, Alicia, I'm going to go to you on this because the Panama Papers has been so in the news. Did the Star have anything to do with that? The Panama Papers have been in the news a lot over the last few weeks, and there was obviously a huge dump of information, offshore corporate holdings, bank accounts, and so on. What happens to the people who have been named in the Panama Papers other than the fact that all of what they were doing is no longer private?
Well, it depends where they're from. I mean, I'm Ukrainian. One of the people named in those papers is the Ukrainian president. He's all over the news. Our previous president was in the news. Our current president is in the news. What's happening to him? I don't think much. I don't think it's anything effective is happening. But if I think some Canadians were named, and again, some of those activities offshore are legitimate, legal. Some of them may not appear to be fair, which again goes back to the question of perception, right?
But you look at the Prime Minister of Iceland was forced to step down.
Exactly.
The President of Ukraine is still the President of Ukraine.
And that has a lot to do with the role of civil society. People going to the streets and saying, we will not stand for this type of behavior. Ukrainians are getting a bit tired in that respect, I think, because it's the same old story. But I think if equivalent happened in Canada, we would do the same. The Canadians would go and rise up against this type of behavior. And
Akash, what do you see in terms of sanctions for those who may have done bad in the Panama Papers case?
It's an interesting question. It is important to say that many of the people named in the papers may have been engaged in secretive activities, but not necessarily criminal activities. And the papers have not yet been released to national governments. So actual investigators, criminal investigators, have not had a chance to look at them and determine, above and beyond the question of whether this is embarrassing, have there been any criminal activities? Having said that, I think the most damaging part of the Panama Papers are the kinds of people who have been named in them, heads of government, heads of state, in addition to major economic actors. And merely the perception that they are shielding their activities from public scrutiny is terribly damaging. It feeds into the sense that the laws that bind the weak and the powerless do not bind the great and the powerful. And ultimately, the reason the Prime Minister of Iceland had to resign wasn't because there was anything illegal about what he had done. It was because he had failed to come clean to his population about it. And in a particular irony, I should mention, Prime Minister Johansson had, prior to this scandal breaking, invited me to go to Iceland to speak to the Icelandic Parliament and his colleagues about this exact issue, about secret offshore companies.
Come on.
He has now resigned. His successor has maintained the invitation. And so I will be going to meet with the Prime Minister and President on this subject. And as you can imagine, it has gone from being what was supposed to be a fairly dry and technical exercise to one that is potentially incendiary.
Have you asked the successor Prime Minister whether there's any offshore business in that case?
In his case?
Yeah.
I will be sure to ask him that.
You will ask, okay. You ask and report back to us. Okay, speaking of the great and mighty and corrupt, we all like soccer around this table, right? Or football, I guess, as you call it in Europe and other places in the world. FIFA is clearly one of the most corrupt organizations in the world. That has been proved. And HBO's John Oliver had a field day with FIFA. Let's take a look.
After he was arrested, he left jail in an ambulance claiming exhaustion. Exhaustion that he then recovered from miraculously quickly.
Hours after he was released from jail, the former FIFA exec turned politician was defiant as he addressed a rally.
That is cocky, denying any involvement while singing "Every Little Thing's Gonna Be All Right." As songs go, that's a little on the nose. I guess we're just lucky that he didn't go with "Got Your Money" by Old Dirty Bastard. Which, come to think of it, are 3 words that describe Jack Warner perfectly.
What happened to Jack Warner?
I feel it's necessary to start off by putting this into context by saying that even before he was criminally charged, he was identified by FIFA, and he was thrown out of or forced to resign from FIFA as a result of his corrupt behavior. To me, being too corrupt for FIFA is like being too evil for hell. That gives you a sense of how far this man had taken it. And he's also a good example of why transparency is a necessary but not sufficient condition to bring about accountability. Warner was, in addition to being a vice president of FIFA, also the Minister of Sport for Trinidad and Tobago. After the corruption broke, he was ousted from office by his prime minister, the party whip was withdrawn from him, and he resigned his seat as a parliamentarian, only to run in the by-election. Not only did he win the by-election, he won with an increased majority over what he had held previously.
What does that tell you?
Several things. First of all, it says that we have reached a point, I think, where a 24-hour media cycle and an inundation with information has made it more difficult for simple information to shame the shameless. People now feel that they can ride out a story. Secondly, it speaks to a terribly and tragically profound sense of cynicism amongst the electorate in that country and indeed around the world. Because when I spoke to people in Trinidad and to ask them afterwards, why did you vote for this man? Was it because you disbelieved the accusations? To a person, his constituents said, no, we believed it. Everyone in this country steals from us, but he leaves some crumbs in the constituency. And that to me, goes to the heart of the problem in fighting corruption. It is changing public expectations and public standards. And I will add in one final Jack Warner anecdote, and that is, he has gone down in my organization's history, the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption, as the only person to be preemptively rejected as a member, because while he was running for re-election, he tried to create a GOPAC national chapter in Trinidad, and I had to contact him to say, there is no way on this side of eternity that we will ever allow you to be a member, let alone head of a chapter.
How did he react to that?
He moved on quickly, actually.
He moved on quickly. He started singing. Does your organization, I know you're mostly about the countries, but organizations like FIFA, are you vigilant about them as well?
Yes, our secretariat works a lot on those issues. We as a chapter haven't been that much involved in this, but the secretariat, which is based in Berlin, has recommendations, and we have one of the chapters based in Germany. They actually have a thematic work around corruption in sport. And there's a global corruption report on corruption in sport. So we have a lot of information on that. It's just a matter of disseminating it and educating people.
Let me do one more follow-up with you, which is, now FIFA is not based in the United States.
No.
But it's American officials who are going after FIFA for its corruption right now. Why is that?
For 2 reasons, I think. First of all, international sport is more than just a game. FIFA has annual revenues of about $1.5 billion, which is more than the budget of about 46 of the world's countries. So this is a colossal enterprise with more money than many countries, but with none of the democratic oversight. But in addition to that, the Americans have 2 interests, one which is obvious and one which is implied. Many Europeans say that the reason the Americans went after FIFA is that they're the only country that can do it because Americans don't care about soccer. But the second reason, more substantive, is that the Americans have taken what I would have to say is an admirable position to say that even if $1 in corrupt money passes through an American institution, that gives American authorities jurisdiction to go after the predicate crime. And I think it is extremely promising. Because it is very difficult in an integrated global financial system to steal that much money without some of it passing through an American bank. One important distinction between Canada and the United States isn't so much in the legal framework, it's the amount of resources that go into enforcement.
Without question, I totally agree.
The Canadian Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act is exemplary on paper and has been praised by the OECD, but we are the only G7 country that has received a failing grade for providing totally inadequate resources to the RCMP in pursuing convictions under that act.
In which case, let me go to you on this. Yep. What might we do if we want to be more zealous about clamping down on all of this corruption to do just that?
Give more resources to their RCMP would be one simple solution, but enforcement is very key. It is one of our priority areas that we focus on because, again, you can have the laws, you can have the institutions, but if you don't have the right expertise, and in particular in white-collar crime, working at their RCMP, if they don't have the right resources, if you don't have prosecutors that are willing to take those cases, there is no enforcement. And you are correct in saying we were ranked as weak. We're not doing as much enforcement as the other countries.
And I should say that IMF report that I mentioned in 2008, the IMF pointed to enforcement as a relatively weak area in Canada. So I agree with Akash. The laws on the books are comprehensive, and we need to be focusing more on enforcement. But I should say, we've been saying this for many, many years.
And we're not there yet.
We've been singing the enforcement song, and something else needs to be done.
Well, look at just a small example in Ontario of enforcement. The orange helicopter scandal investigation is still continuing, I believe, 4 years later. Okay, that was exposed in roughly 2011, if I'm not mistaken. And here we are almost 5 years later. We don't know where that investigation is at. I don't know if it's entirely about resources as it is about strategic direction. Sometimes you think you have to work smart and not just hard. Sometimes you have to do more with less. And I wonder if sometimes there's a scattergun approach and you just have to pick the right targets and enforce in a coherent way.
Got it. Fortunately, the four of you are all beyond reproach. So thank you all for coming into TVO tonight and helping us out with this. Akash Maharaj from GOPAC, the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption. Anita Anand from the University of Toronto. On the other side of the table, Alicia Nahirny from Transparency International Canada, and Martin Redcon of the Toronto Star. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.